You won't believe what happened to me last Saturday morning. I walked out of my house, coffee in hand, ready for a peaceful day, and found my garage completely blocked by a brand new luxury SUV. And not just any neighbor, it was Karen. The same Karen who has terrorized this neighborhood for years with her petty rules and constant complaints. I knocked on her door. I called her phone, nothing. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a blocked driveway. This was personal. And I was about to give Karen a lesson she'd never forget in the most unforgettable way imaginable. I never expected a peaceful Saturday morning to turn into complete chaos. I walked out of my house, coffee in hand, ready for a relaxing day, only to find the impossible. My garage, my sanctuary for years, was completely blocked by a brand new luxury SUV. And not just any neighbor, it was Karen. The same Karen who has made it her life mission to micromanage our entire neighborhood, from the height of our grass to the exact placement of our trash cans. I froze, staring at the sleek car parked diagonally across my driveway. The polished black exterior gleamed in the morning sun, and the chrome rims sparkled with that smug, I'm untouchable kind of shine. There was no note, no warning, nothing. Just her look at me, I own this street attitude glaring back at me from her tinted windows. My frustration surged instantly. I'd dealt with HOA complaints, petty fines, and constant passive-aggressive comments from her before. But this was personal. This wasn't a fine over a slightly crooked mailbox. This was a direct assault on my time, my space, and my sanity. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I reminded myself, stay calm. Don't escalate. I tried the usual polite approach first. I knocked on her door, carefully choosing each word in my mind as I rang the bell. There was a long pause, followed by the faint sound of the TV blaring inside her house. No movement. No answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and called her number. Straight to voicemail. Hi, Karen. It's me. Your car is blocking my garage. Could you move it, please? I left the message in my calmest tone, hoping reason would prevail. I hung up. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Still nothing. I could feel my patience fraying like a rope under too much tension. I muttered under my breath, she can't be serious. Looking around, I realized my frustration wasn't just anger. It was the kind that fuels creative chaos. The kind that tells you, if she's going to play games, I'm going to make sure everyone remembers who the real player is. I paced back and forth, imagining the SUV still parked there in a week, a month, maybe even longer, as Karen basked in her little act of control. My mind raced. What could I do? Call the HOA. Please. That would take weeks, if it even did anything. Talk to the police? They'd probably smile politely and shrug. No, this had to be handled personally. I considered moving the car myself, but it was massive, brand new. And besides, if I touched it, there'd be hell to pay. I needed a plan, and not just any plan. It had to be bold, memorable, and above all, satisfying. As I sipped my coffee and stared at the SUV, my brain went through scenarios. I could call a tow truck, but then Karen would call the cops, and the story would be boring. No, I needed something bigger. Something absurdly spectacular. That's when the idea hit me, a helicopter. Why not? If she wanted drama, I'd give her a blockbuster. I grabbed my laptop and started researching airlift services. I found a local company that specialized in moving heavy equipment with helicopters. I called them, half expecting them to laugh at my request. And laugh they did at first. You want to airlift a car onto someone else's lawn? The operator chuckled. I assured him I wasn't joking, giving him the exact coordinates, the SUV's make and model, and my very specific instructions. He paused for a second, and then, surprisingly, said, All right, we can do this. The rest of the morning was a blur of preparations. I cleared my driveway to make room for the helicopter, made sure the neighbors had a good vantage point, and double-checked every detail. Karen still hadn't emerged. I couldn't help but imagine her, probably sipping tea somewhere, feeling victorious, thinking she had won. Little did she know, her little stunt had just set the stage for the most dramatic Saturday our neighborhood had ever seen. By early afternoon, the low rumble of a helicopter echoed over the houses. Curious neighbors started peeking out of their windows, whispering to each other and pointing. Some even began recording with their phones. I stepped outside, wearing a calm, confident expression, though my heart was pounding with excitement. The helicopter hovered above my driveway. I could see the crew securing straps around Karen's SUV with precision and care. The SUV, heavy and intimidating, lifted effortlessly into the air. I swear it gleamed even brighter, almost as if it knew it was about to make history. Karen finally appeared, rushing out of her house, screaming at the top of her lungs. "What are you doing?" Her arms flailed wildly, her face a portrait of pure disbelief. I took a slow sip of coffee, keeping my expression as nonchalant as possible. "Morning, Karen," I said, almost cheerfully. "Your car's just going for a little ride." She looked like she might faint. "This is illegal. You can't do this. My HOA." "Relax," I interrupted gently. "No one's getting hurt. Just a little lesson in humility." The helicopter pilot skillfully navigated toward the mayor's lawn at the end of the street. I couldn't help but laugh as I pictured the mayor stepping out to check his mail, only to see Karen's luxury SUV sitting perfectly on his front yard, tires slightly sinking into the grass. The neighbors outside were cheering, clapping, and capturing every moment on video. Some were even calling their friends to come see the spectacle. Karen reached the helicopter, still shouting, but by then it was too late. The SUV gently descended onto the mayor's lawn, perfectly positioned like an art installation. She ran up, trying to stop the process, but the pilot shook his head and continued the operation. I watched as her jaw dropped in shock and anger. The mayor, who had been inside the house all along, stepped out. Instead of yelling, he simply looked at the scene, shook his head slowly, and said, "Well, I guess someone's making a statement today." Karen froze, unsure whether to scream at me or beg for mercy. Her confidence had evaporated like morning fog in the sun. By late afternoon, the SUV was safely back in her driveway, slightly scratched from the straps, but otherwise intact. Karen stomped up to my door, face red with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. I smiled calmly. "It really isn't. Just try parking responsibly next time." The neighborhood, however, was buzzing with excitement. People waved at me, whispered stories of the day Karen's car flew, and even the HOA refrained from bothering me for weeks. I learned something vital that day. Sometimes, patience and creativity are more powerful than anger. Boldness, timing, and a little bit of audacity can make even the most controlling neighbor think twice. The SUV finally touched down gently, perfectly centered on the mayor's lawn. Tires slightly sank into the grass, giving it an artfully placed look. Karen ran forward, screaming, waving her arms, trying to salvage some dignity. But it was hopeless. Every second she spent shouting only made the moment more epic. The mayor stepped outside, confused at first, then looked at me, then at Karen, then back at me. And you know what he did? He didn't yell. He didn't call the cops. He just shook his head slowly and muttered, "I guess someone's making a statement today." Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was possible. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She was officially outmatched. OAS, I finally sat down with another cup of coffee in my garage, now free and mine again. I couldn't help but grin. The chaos had been worth it. Saturday mornings would never be the same in our neighborhood, and Karen would never dare park like a dictator ever again. After staring at the car for a solid 5 minutes, a crazy idea started to form in my mind. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't just fear or frustration. It was excitement, the kind that only comes when you realize you can turn a problem into a spectacle. What if I didn't just move it? What if I made statement? A bold, unforgettable statement that Karen, and every nosy neighbor on the street, would remember for years. The thought alone made me grin uncontrollably. I could see it in my mind. A helicopter hovering over the driveway, Karen screaming like a banshee, neighbors spilling out of their houses to watch the chaos unfold. And the best part? There was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. She had finally pushed me too far, and I was about to take the kind of action that only happens in movies, or, well, in a suburban nightmare of epic proportions. I paced back and forth, trying to calm myself enough to plan. Every scenario I imagined had to be perfect. I didn't want a tow truck story. That was boring. I didn't want to call the police. Karen would just spin it as harassment, and I'd get a lecture for not following HOA protocol. No, this needed to be cinematic, theatrical, and above all, satisfying. The kind of move that people tell their grandchildren about. Remember the day Karen's SUV flew? I grabbed my phone and started calling local airlift services. I needed pros, people who could lift a multi-thousand-pound SUV safely and place it somewhere, preferably somewhere humiliating. Most operators laughed at first, thinking I was joking. You want to airlift a car? Like onto someone else's lawn? One of them asked, chuckling so hard I could hear it through the phone. I kept my voice calm, but firm. I'm not joking. I'll provide all the coordinates, the make, model, and color of the SUV. You just bring the chopper in the afternoon and follow my instructions. Safety first, but yes, it needs to be memorable. After a long pause, the operator finally sighed. All right, we can do it, but this is insane. I grinned like a madman. Perfect. Insane is exactly the point. Meanwhile, Karen was nowhere to be seen. Of course, she was probably off somewhere, sipping her overpriced latte, smiling smugly, thinking she had successfully asserted dominance over the street. That's what made this so delicious. Little did she know, she had just triggered the most dramatic Saturday morning of her life. Every second she stayed away was another second that suspense built to a cinematic climax. I spent the next hour preparing my stage. I cleared my driveway, made sure there were no obstacles, and set up a vantage point for the neighbors to watch the action unfold. I even set up my phone on a tripod to record the entire event. It would be impossible not to share this moment on social media. By mid-afternoon, the low rumble of the helicopter reached my ears. I looked up and saw it approaching, the rotor blades spinning like giant metal fans cutting through the blue sky. The sound alone drew the attention of everyone in the neighborhood. Windows opened, doors swung wide, and within minutes, a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk. Some were whispering excitedly, others were recording with their phones, and a few older folks shook their heads, muttering about the good old days when Saturday mornings were peaceful. I stepped outside, holding my coffee like a prop in a movie. I wanted to look calm, collected, and completely in control, because in my mind I was. The helicopter hovered above the driveway, a massive shadow falling over Karen's shiny SUV. The crew worked efficiently, carefully securing straps around the vehicle, checking every angle, making sure nothing would slip or tilt. And then it happened. With a powerful lift, the SUV slowly rose off the driveway. I could feel the vibration through the ground, and the vehicle gleamed even more under the sunlight, as if it were aware that it was about to make history. The neighbors gasped, a few clapped, and some started cheering. I could barely contain my excitement. Karen, of course, appeared at that exact moment. I swear I had never seen someone move so fast. She came charging out of her house, face red with fury, hands flailing in the air. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her voice a mix of panic and outrage. I took a slow sip of coffee, keeping my expression neutral. "Morning, Karen," I said sweetly. "Your car's just going for a little ride." "This is illegal. You can't do this." "My HOA." She sputtered, but I held up a hand. "Relax," I said calmly. "No one's getting hurt. Just perspective." Her eyes widened as the reality sank in. There was nothing she could do. She stomped forward, tried to grab the straps, even shouted at the helicopter crew. But they were professionals. I could see the confusion and helplessness on her face, and honestly, it was beautiful. I directed the pilot toward the mayor's house at the end of the street. This was the piece de resistance. I imagined the mayor stepping out for his afternoon walk, only to see Karen's luxury SUV perched perfectly on his front lawn like an art installation. The helicopter navigated skillfully, lowering the SUV slowly, carefully, with precision that even Karen couldn't interrupt. Neighbors were going wild. Phones were out. Kids pointed and screamed in delight. A few older men shook their heads and muttered, "Well, that's one way to deal with Karen." I could hear laughter and whispers echoing down the street. Some people were already calling friends to come witness the spectacle, and a few had started live streaming it. This was turning into a neighborhood legend in real time. Outmaneuvered and completely humiliated, all in front of the entire neighborhood. By the time the SUV was returned to her driveway a few hours later, slightly scratched from the straps, but otherwise intact, Karen was fuming. She stomped up to my door, demanding answers. "This isn't over," she hissed. I smiled calmly. "It really isn't. Just try parking responsibly next time." The neighborhood buzzed for weeks. People laughed about the incident, shared videos, and told stories. Even the HOA, who usually sided with Karen, refrained from bothering me. I had learned something important. Patience, creativity, and audacity can be more effective than anger. You don't always have to fight with words. Sometimes, a little spectacle is worth 1,000 arguments. And as I sat back in my driveway with a fresh cup of coffee, I couldn't stop smiling. Karen had learned a lesson she would never forget. And I had just turned a boring Saturday morning into a story, for by 2 p.m., the rumble of a helicopter grew louder above our neighborhood. The deep, vibrating hum of its rotors filled the air, rattling windows and setting the leaves on nearby trees quivering. Birds scattered in all directions, startled, their wings beating frantically as the giant metal bird approached. Curious neighbors started peeking out of their windows, some stepping onto their porches, others cautiously lifting blinds, just enough to catch a glimpse of what was about to happen. I stepped outside, taking a slow sip of my coffee, wearing my serious but slightly mischievous face. I had spent the last few hours imagining this exact moment, rehearsing every movement and line in my head. This was my stage, my performance, and my masterpiece. The driveway, usually just a simple slab of concrete, had become the focal point of a suburban spectacle. I could feel the energy of anticipation crackling through the air like static. The helicopter hovered above my driveway, its massive blades cutting through the sky, whipping up gusts that rattled flower pots and sent papers skittering across my lawn. The pilot circled slowly, checking the positioning, while the crew below began carefully lowering heavy-duty straps around Karen's SUV. Every movement was deliberate, precise. The straps wrapped around the car's body like metallic vines, securing it for its airborne journey. And then it happened. With a subtle but powerful lift, the SUV left the ground. I swear the car gleamed even brighter under the sunlight, as if it were aware of the magnitude of its moment in history. Tires spinning slightly in the air, the SUV appeared weightless, suspended in the sky by sheer engineering prowess and a dash of madness. I could hear the gasps and murmurs from the neighbors, a chorus of astonishment that confirmed I had indeed captured everyone's attention. I directed the pilot toward the mayor's house at the end of the street, pointing carefully as if orchestrating a symphony. Each movement of the helicopter felt like choreography, and the car, Karen's luxury SUV, was my solo performer. I imagined expressions on every face in the neighborhood, disbelief, shock, maybe even admiration at the sheer audacity of it all. Phones were out, recording every moment, ready to immortalize what was about to become legendary. Karen, of course, appeared at the worst possible moment for her. I'm convinced she had been inside, probably adjusting her hair, straightening her outfit, sipping some expensive drink, thinking she had won the morning by asserting her dominance. But reality hit her like a brick when she saw her SUV slowly rising into the air. Her scream could probably be heard 3 blocks away. "What are you doing?" she shouted, waving her arms like a mad director on a chaotic movie set. I just stood there, calm as ever, sipping my coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. My expression didn't change, though inside, I was vibrating with excitement. The neighbors were holding their breaths, some leaning out of second-story windows for a better view, others standing on lawns, mouths agape. Even the mailman paused mid-delivery, unsure whether he should continue or just stand there and witness history. Karen ran toward the driveway, her heels clicking furiously against the concrete, arms flailing as she shouted, "Stop it! This is illegal! My HOA!" I interrupted her, my tone calm and deliberate. "Relax, Karen. No one's getting hurt. Just a little lesson in perspective." She froze mid-step, eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected to be addressed so serenely, while the helicopter hovered above her prized SUV. Her breathing became heavier, punctuated by sharp intakes as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She shouted something about calling the police and harassment, but her words were lost in the roar of the helicopter blades. I could see her panic escalating. She ran alongside the SUV, trying to grab the straps, to somehow physically stop what was happening. Her hand slapped the metal straps, but it was useless. The crew had expertly secured the vehicle. I could almost hear her internal monologue. Why me? Why now? How is this even possible? Meanwhile, the neighbors were fully invested. Some were cheering, some laughing, and some were just standing frozen, mouths open. I noticed little kids pointing excitedly, mimicking helicopter noises with their tiny hands. One elderly man muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Well, that's one way to handle Karen. Even the cat from 3 houses down had ventured onto a roof to get a better view, its tail twitching in confusion. The helicopter slowly began its journey toward the mayor's lawn. I followed every movement with the precision of a director, occasionally pointing to ensure the car remained perfectly balanced. I could feel the collective tension of the crowd. Every rotation of the rotors, every gust of wind, every tilt of the SUV seemed to stretch time. The suspense was intoxicating. Kara, meanwhile, had shifted from panic to desperation. She was screaming at me, at the crew, at the sky itself. You can't do this. It's my property. I will sue you. Do you hear me? I will sue you. Her words echoed down the street, bouncing off houses and cars, punctuated by the constant roar of the helicopter. I smiled faintly, taking another sip of coffee, imagining the headline. Neighborhood legend. Karen's SUV airlifted by heroic neighbor. I could practically see the YouTube clicks, the TikTok shares, the endless social media commentary. This was more than just a prank or revenge. This was history. As the helicopter approached the mayor's lawn, I signaled the pilot for a careful descent. The SUV lowered slowly, tires hovering above the grass like it was floating on air. The neighbors gasped in unison, some leaning forward so far they almost toppled over. Kids squealed with delight, some pointing and shouting. It's flying! It's flying! Adults whispered excitedly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing uncontrollably. Karen sprinted ahead, trying to intercept the car. Her hands were now trembling as she reached out, as if sheer willpower could stop the descent. But physics, engineering, and sheer audacity were on my side. The SUV touched down gently on the mayor's front lawn, slightly angled, perfectly placed, like a centerpiece in some absurd outdoor art exhibition. Tires sank slightly into the grass, leaving small impressions, a testament to the SUV's journey through the sky. Karen stopped abruptly, face red, chest heaving, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and utter humiliation plastered across her features. She stomped toward me, shaking her fists, but no words came out at first. The neighbors were fully invested, some clapping, others laughing so hard they could barely breathe. A few of them had already pulled out cameras and were recording the final moments, muttering to each other about how they had never seen anything like this in their lives. The mayor, stepping outside after hearing the commotion, approached slowly. He looked at the SUV, then at Karen, then at me. Instead of yelling, calling the cops, or even scolding me, he simply shook his head slowly. I guess someone's making a statement today, he said, half amused, half bewildered. Karen's jaw literally dropped, and she stood there, motionless, unsure whether to scream, cry, or flee. I couldn't help but grin. This was the moment I had been envisioning for hours. Every detail had unfolded perfectly. The helicopter, the neighbors, the suspense, and most importantly, Karen's total loss of composure. Her usual aura of control and superiority had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. By the time the SUV was eventually returned to her driveway a few hours later, slightly scratched from the straps, but otherwise intact, Karen was still fuming. She stomped up to my door, face red, hair disheveled, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. This isn't over, she hissed through gritted teeth. I smiled calmly, leaning against the doorway with my coffee in hand. It really isn't. But maybe, just maybe, try parking responsibly next time. The aftermath was just as extraordinary. Neighbors couldn't stop talking about it. Social media blew up with videos and reactions. The HOA, usually so eager to side with Karen, stayed conspicuously silent for weeks. I had learned something vital. Boldness, creativity, and a little audacity can be far more effective than anger or complaints. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't petty or aggressive, it's unforgettable. And as I finally sat back in my driveway that evening, sipping another cup of coffee and watching the sunset, I felt a sense of satisfaction unlike any other. Saturday mornings would never be the same. Not for Karen, not for the neighborhood, and definitely not for me. The story of the day Karen's SUV flew would be told and retold for years, and I had the perfect front row seat. With precision, the helicopter gently lowered the SUV right onto the mayor's front lawn. Every movement felt like it was in slow motion, as if the entire neighborhood had collectively paused to witness the spectacle. The tires sank slightly into the lush green grass, leaving subtle impressions that looked almost intentional, like a sculptor had placed it there with care. The angle was perfect, slightly tilted, as if the car had been designed to sit on that exact spot as a bold statement piece. I couldn't help but imagine the mayor stepping out for his afternoon walk. He often did, taking slow, deliberate steps down the path from his porch, sipping a cup of tea, enjoying the quiet that typically defined our suburban neighborhood. Today, however, his serene routine was about to be shattered. I pictured him reaching for the doorknob, swinging the door open, only to see Karen's luxury SUV perched like a monument on his perfectly manicured lawn. I could almost hear the double take, the sharp intake of breath, and then that slow blink of disbelief as reality set in. Meanwhile, the neighbors erupted in applause and laughter. Children squealed in delight, pointing at the airborne SUV with excitement, while adults laughed and shook their heads in disbelief. Some were filming the moment on their phones, capturing Karen's public humiliation for posterity. I could hear snippets of commentary as neighbors whispered to each other, incredulous. Did that just happen? I can't believe it. Karen's going to lose her mind. Karen's face, however, told a different story. It turned an alarming shade of red, the kind of crimson that only comes from a mix of rage, embarrassment, and utter disbelief. She sprinted toward the mayor's house, her heels clacking on the pavement, a whirlwind of fury and panic. I could see the tight set of her jaw, the frantic movements of her hands as she gesticulated wildly. Every step she took seemed to scream, "I will not be defeated. I will not be humiliated." But the truth was undeniable. She had been completely outmaneuvered. When she reached the lawn, she expected some kind of rescue or intervention. Perhaps the mayor would yell at me, call the authorities, or demand that her car be returned immediately. Instead, she was met by the mayor himself, standing calmly at the edge of his porch, arms folded, taking in the scene with an almost bemused expression. And you know what he did? He didn't yell at me. He didn't call the cops. He didn't even appear particularly upset. He simply shook his head slowly, as if acknowledging that yes, I had indeed orchestrated something remarkable. "I think you've officially made your point," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable note of amusement. Karen froze. For a moment, her mouth opened, then closed. She opened it again, trying to form words, but the roar of the helicopter's rotors had subsided, leaving her only with the weight of the situation and the silent judgment of the mayor. Her fists clenched at her sides, and she shifted from foot to foot, like a caged animal, desperately trying to regain composure. The neighbors, meanwhile, continued to cheer. Some clapped, others laughed, and a few even whistled. I could see the smirks of longtime friends who had silently rooted for this moment, who had endured Karen's petty rule over the neighborhood for years. Even those who had only recently moved and seemed thrilled to witness such a dramatic event unfold. The atmosphere was electric, charged with collective delight, and the thrill of watching a tyrant humbled. In that moment, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't angry words or lawsuits, it's creativity. And apparently a helicopter. I couldn't stop grinning as I watched Karen flail helplessly, realizing that her carefully cultivated aura of control had crumbled entirely in the span of an afternoon. I imagined her trying to tell the story later, frantically explaining the logic of what had happened to friends, co-workers, or even the HOA board. How could anyone make sense of this? She would be laughed at, mocked, and remembered as the neighbor whose car had literally taken flight, only to land in the most embarrassing location imaginable. The mayor, ever the picture of calm authority, finally stepped forward. He didn't reprimand me, but he did offer a wry comment. "Next time," he said, tilting his head slightly and raising an eyebrow, "maybe we stick to smaller projects?" I chuckled, raising my coffee in mock salute, while Karen's face burned brighter, if that was even possible. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the twitching in her jaw, and the furious glare she directed at me. But I didn't flinch. I had orchestrated this perfectly. Every detail had been accounted for. The timing, the helicopter, the neighbors' reactions, the mayor's approval, and, of course, Karen's public humiliation. As the helicopter descended and finally lifted off, the SUV remained in place, like a monument to audacity. The neighbors continued to talk, laugh, and share the moment with anyone they could call. Children ran around the yard, reenacting the scene with toy helicopters and miniature cars. I could hear snippets of conversations from across the street. "Did you see her face? I've never laughed so hard in my life. This will go down in neighborhood history." Karen, however, was beyond reason. She stomped back to her house, muttering under her breath, pulling at her hair, and glancing periodically at the SUV as if sheer willpower could undo what had just happened. I could hear the distant sound of her phone dialing repeatedly, probably calling the HOA, the police, or anyone she thought might intervene. But by then, it was too late. The moment had already cemented itself in the collective memory of the neighborhood. I walked across the street, waving to neighbors who were still filming and commenting. "It's all about creativity," I called out, smiling broadly. A few of them laughed, nodding in agreement. One of the older gentlemen shook his head, muttering, "I've lived here 20 years and never seen anything like this." I could only grin and raise my cup of coffee in response. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the tension finally started to dissipate. The helicopter had flown off, Karen had retreated to her home in defeat, and the neighbors had dispersed, many stopping to take one last look at the now famous SUV perched triumphantly on the mayor's lawn. I leaned against my car, savoring the moment, sipping my coffee, and reflecting on what had just transpired. This wasn't just revenge. This was a statement about boldness, ingenuity, and the power of creativity over anger. I realized that while lawsuits and angry confrontations can sometimes achieve results, they rarely leave a mark on memory. This would be remembered, retold, and laughed about for years to come. Karen, meanwhile, was pacing inside her home, phone in hand, probably trying to explain away the spectacle. But I knew the truth. The image of her luxury SUV on the mayor's lawn, the neighbors' laughter, the helicopter in the sky, and her own disbelief would be burned into her memory forever. Every time she looked at that SUV, she would remember that audacity had triumphed over arrogance. I took a final sip of coffee, looking around at the neighborhood. People were returning to their routines, but there was a buzz in the air, an energy that hadn't existed before. I could see smiles on faces, laughter echoing from porches, and even a few thumbs up from neighbors who had quietly tolerated Karen's antics for years. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Revenge doesn't have to be violent, angry, or petty. It can be creative, bold, and memorable. It can be something that transforms an ordinary Saturday into a story people will tell for generations. And as it turned out, it could involve a helicopter, a luxury SUV, and the perfect combination of timing, planning, and a little bit of flair. As I finally walked back to my house, leaving Karen to her fury and the mayor to his bemusement, I felt a sense of satisfaction unlike anything I had ever experienced. Saturday mornings would never be the same. Not for Karen, not for the neighborhood, and definitely not for me. The story of the day Karen's SUV landed on the mayor's lawn would be told over barbecues, shared in group chats, and replayed in memories for years to come. And in that moment, I realized something else. Sometimes, the most powerful tool in your arsenal isn't confrontation, anger, or authority. It's imagination. It's creativity. And apparently, a helicopter. By the time Karen returned home later that evening, the neighborhood was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Shadows stretched lazily across the lawns, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Everything looked calm and ordinary on the surface, but underneath, the energy of the afternoon's events still pulsed through the neighborhood. Karen's SUV sat back in her driveway, slightly scratched from the helicopter straps, but otherwise perfectly intact. It was like the calm after a storm, except the storm had left a very public, unforgettable mark. Karen stormed up her driveway as soon as she saw her vehicle in its rightful place. Her heels clicked furiously against the concrete as she marched toward me, fists clenched and face flushed with fury. It was the same face she always wore when she was about to issue a complaint or a scolding, except now it was mixed with pure humiliation. She swung open her front door and started barking questions and accusations, clearly expecting that some kind of authoritative intervention would undo the spectacle she had been subjected to. "I want answers. Right now," she demanded, her voice rising like a siren. "How did this happen? Who gave you permission? This is outrageous. My SUV, my property." I calmly took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment like it was a fine wine. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, and I let it settle for a second before speaking. "Karen," I said, my voice measured, almost serene, "your SUV was blocking my garage. You left me no choice, and frankly, you underestimated me. Your arrogance has consequences." She froze mid-sentence, blinking rapidly, trying to process what I had just said. "Consequences?" she repeated, her voice cracking slightly, disbelief mingling with anger. You can't just, this is insane. I'll call the HOA. I'll report you. The police." "Yes," I said, cutting her off gently. "Consequences, but not in the way you might expect. Not with fines or letters or petty complaints. Sometimes, consequences are creative. Bold moves get remembered. And your actions this morning, they set the stage for exactly that." Karen's jaw dropped slightly, her face flushed an even deeper shade of red, veins standing out on her temples. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, the kind of shock that comes from realizing that all your meticulous control, all your planning, and all your intimidation had been turned on its head in a single, audacious act. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, struggling to find words that would make sense of the impossible. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was quietly observing. Windows were cracked open, porch lights flickered on as people peeked outside, and even from a distance, I could hear whispers. "Did that really happen? I can't believe it. That's the best thing I've seen in years." The story had already begun to circulate, like wildfire. By the time Karen finally realized she couldn't argue her way out of this spectacle, the community had already formed its own narrative, and I was clearly on the winning side. Children ran across lawns, reenacting the scene with toy helicopters and miniature cars. They flapped their arms, shouted commands, and giggled uncontrollably, fully immersed in the legend they had just witnessed. Adults chuckled quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief, while a few even whistled. The sound of neighbors talking, laughing, and sharing their astonishment filled the air, a sort of soundtrack to Karen's slow realization that her plan to assert dominance had spectacularly backfired. Karen, ever stubborn, tried to reclaim some control. She stomped back to her house, muttering to herself, dialing the HOA, and presumably concocting elaborate complaints about unsafe behavior, airlifting vehicles without consent, and public humiliation. I could imagine the emails and phone calls she must have sent that evening. Dramatic, over the top, and completely futile. But it didn't matter. By now, the story had a life of its own. The legend of the flying SUV had already begun, and Karen had no way to stop it. I wandered back toward my garage, taking slow, deliberate steps. Every stride felt victorious. The driveway, my sanctuary, was clear once again. My coffee cup, warm and comforting in my hand, became a symbol of triumph. That simple beverage, sipped slowly, represented the calm in the eye of the storm I had orchestrated. Saturday mornings had never felt so satisfying. As I leaned against the doorway of my garage, watching the street, I noticed that neighbors were still lingering outside. Some were sharing videos, laughing as they recounted what they had just witnessed. A few people who had initially stayed indoors were now creeping to their windows or stepping onto their porches, drawn by the lingering buzz of excitement. Every glance toward my house carried a mixture of amusement and respect. Even those who didn't know me well seemed to acknowledge that something remarkable had taken place. The HOA, typically eager to intervene at the slightest hint of drama, remained conspicuously quiet for weeks afterward. I had no doubt that they were discussing the incident in their meetings, possibly writing careful memos, but the reality was undeniable. The audacity, the precision, and the spectacle had left a mark that no rule or regulation could undo. For once, creativity had triumphed over bureaucracy. Karen's behavior over the next few days was predictable. She was more cautious, measuring her movements as she walked down the street. She glanced at driveways before parking, double-checked her rearview mirrors, and hesitated before stepping out of her SUV. Her usual confidence had been replaced with subtle paranoia, a reminder that even the most domineering personalities can be humbled by ingenuity and boldness. Meanwhile, I continued my routine with a sense of satisfaction. Coffee in hand, I would step outside, wave to neighbors, and listen to snippets of conversation as they recounted the event. "Did you see her face?" someone would whisper, trying not to laugh too loudly. "I've never laughed so hard in my life." Another neighbor would nod, smiling broadly. "That's one for the history books. I'll be telling my grandkids about this one." The humor, the astonishment, and the collective memory of the event lingered in the air like a persistent fragrance. Even mundane walks down the street were punctuated with quiet nods, knowing smiles, and occasional waves. People seemed to treat me with a newfound respect, not because of fear, but because of audacity, creativity, and the willingness to take bold action when it mattered most. Karen, of course, tried to reclaim some dignity. She would mutter explanations to anyone who would listen, desperately attempting to spin the narrative in her favor. But the legend had already been written. The image of her SUV suspended in the air, gently lowered onto the mayor's lawn, was imprinted in every witness's mind. No explanation, no complaint, no meeting with the HOA could erase the memory of that moment. I often found myself replaying the event in my mind, reliving the tension of the helicopter hovering over the driveway, the thrill of watching the SUV rise, and the eruption of laughter and astonishment from the neighborhood. It was a story that had started as frustration and inconvenience, but had evolved into something far greater, a legend of creativity, audacity, and perfectly executed revenge. As evening descended fully, casting long shadows across the street, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Cars drove by, children played, and neighbors chatted casually, but beneath the surface, there was a shared understanding. Something extraordinary had occurred. Karen's audacity had been met with equal, if not greater, ingenuity. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted, at least temporarily, in a way that would be remembered for years. I returned to my garage, closing the door behind me, and took a long, contemplative sip of coffee. The events of the day had taught me something invaluable. Boldness and creativity can achieve what anger and complaints never will. The spectacle had been nonviolent, safe, and perfectly executed. And yet, it had delivered results far beyond anything I could have imagined. The neighborhood's support, Karen's humility, and my own sense of satisfaction. That night, I reflected on how a single morning, filled with frustration and seemingly small inconveniences, had been transformed into a story that would echo through the neighborhood for years. It wasn't just about moving a car or embarrassing a neighbor. It was about timing, creativity, courage, and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. Even days later, people would stop to mention it. "I still can't believe it," one neighbor said, laughing as they waved. "That SUV, it literally flew." Others shook their head in amazement. "Best Saturday morning ever. I didn't think our neighborhood could get any more interesting." These moments, small as they seemed, reinforced the fact that bold actions leave lasting impressions. Karen, despite her attempts to regain control, had learned a lesson that would not soon fade. She parked cautiously, moved gingerly, and approached interactions with the neighborhood with a slightly diminished confidence. The balance of power, once so heavily in her favor, had shifted, and she was acutely aware of it. Every glance toward my garage, Every morning she woke to see the same view, reminded her that audacity had consequences, and not always one she could control. As I finally sat back in my garage, coffee in hand, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Saturday mornings would never feel ordinary again. The story, the spectacle, the shared laughter, the astonishment of the neighborhood, and even Karen's humble demeanor created a memory I would cherish indefinitely. Bold moves had been remembered. Creativity had proven itself as the ultimate power play. And in the quiet moments, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the neighborhood settled into evening calm, I realized something profound. Sometimes, life's most remarkable moments come from turning frustration into opportunity, conflict into creativity, and inconvenience into spectacle. And for me, that morning, that helicopter, and that flying SUV had done all of that and more. I smiled, finishing the last of my coffee, knowing that the story of the day Karen's car flew would be told and retold in countless conversations, laughter-filled gatherings, and perhaps even on social media for years to come. It was a legend that started with a blocked driveway and ended with a neighborhood united in awe, amusement, and a newfound respect for boldness and creativity. Saturday mornings had never been so satisfying, and I knew that for years I would remember this day not with frustration, but with a grin, a sip of coffee, and the knowledge that sometimes the boldest move is the one no one expects, but everyone remembers. By the end of the day, Karen's SUV was safely back in her driveway, slightly scratched, and she was fuming like never before. But the neighborhood? They were cheering, laughing, sharing the story, and even the HOA stayed quiet for weeks. I learned something crucial that day. Bold moves get remembered, and creativity is the ultimate power move. So next time someone tries to block your path, maybe don't just get angry, think bigger. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more insane neighborhood stories that you won't see coming.